I often associate summer with pirates. Typically, my family heads to Cape Cod for a couple weeks in July or August, where everything has a nautical aesthetic, and the best round of mini golf can be found at Pirates Cove Adventure Golf. Of course, due to the current state of the world, we're not going anywhere right now, so I'll try to alleviate my sadness with a pirate-themed video. As you viewers probably know, I love obscure Disney tidbits. There are plenty of Disney movies and shorts that remain unfinished for one reason or another. Many potential features were shelved because of World War II and the need to concentrate on beating the Axis, rather than using resources to make lavish movies. While some movies were completed later on, albeit some in an abbreviated fashion, others were simply cancelled. Such was the fate of Morgan's Ghost. The earliest draft of the unmade pirate adventure was Pieces of Eight, or The Three Buccaneers. It was to be the first feature-length movie that starred Mickey, Donald, and Goofy. The earliest draft had the trio running a New England inn. With them are Pluto the dog and an old parrot who entertains the patrons with tall tales. One day, Pete enters along with several other unsavory men who are the descendants of famous pirates. They kidnap the parrot who holds the secret to a buried treasure. Mickey, Donald, Goofy, and Pluto stow away on their ship to rescue the parrot, and they all end up on a tropical island where they encounter angry natives and Robinson Crusoe, who happens to be the parrot's owner. Mickey and Pete have a climactic battle over a volcano, and the story ends happily, with the heroes getting the treasure, the pirates defeated, and Robinson being reunited with his parrot. The story was reworked over the next 2 years, and eventually titled Morgan's Ghost. In this version, the trio still work at the inn, minus Pluto. One stormy night, a parrot named Yellow Beak seeks shelter, trying to hide out from Pete. Pete barges in a few moments later, but cannot find the bird. Once he leaves, Yellow Beak explains that he has the treasure map that Pete's been after. Mickey and the others agree to help Yellow Beak and set sail to find the treasure, while Pete listens in at the window. The next day, the heroes buy a ship from Pete, who has disguised himself as an elderly widow. As they sail, Pete sneaks around trying to find the map. In one scene, he sneaks into their room at night and pokes around, cutting a hole in Donald's hammock among other things. Goofy begins to sleepwalk, and Pete follows him, hoping to find the map that way. He is led into a dark room. Upon striking a match, Pete realizes he's in the powder room and flees before he blows himself up. Eventually, Pete's true identity is revealed. His rat henchmen, who bear a striking resemblance to Mortimer Mouse, attack the heroes. Yellow Beak is captured and the others end up adrift on a raft. The good guys make it to the island and find the treasure chest in a cave. The chest does not contain treasure, however, but rather a trio of comical ghosts, including Henry Morgan, hence the title. The ghosts are unable to reveal the location of the treasure because dead men tell no tales. The treasure is located in Hangman's Garden, which is full of perils, including enchanted garden shears of all things. Mickey and company are ultimately able to rescue Yellowbeak and find the treasure. 2 endings were planned, one in which they are able to recover the treasure, and another where Pete manages to escape with the loot. The dejected heroes return home, only to find out that Pete has been arrested for counterfeiting. Yellowbeak remembers the location of the real treasure, and everyone sets off once again. This honestly sounds like it would have made a fun movie. Thankfully, although it was never animated, a substantial amount was storyboarded, and those storyboards led to one of the most important Disney comics of all time. Although Disney Comics had been running in the newspapers since 1930, new material was needed for comic books in the early 1940s. 2 artists, Carl Barks and Jack Hanna, had collaborated on an original adventure story starring Pluto called Pluto Saves the Ship. This wartime comic, where Pluto has to protect a ship from foreign spies, was a whopping 51 pages. Their next assignment was to make use of the discarded Morgan's Ghost storyboards. They were handed a script by Bob Karp, who also scripted the Donald Duck Daily comic strip, which closely adapted the movie's plot, with the biggest difference being Huey, Dewey, and Louie replacing Mickey and Goofy. The story ended up being even longer than the Pluto comic, 64 pages to be exact. Since this is a mammoth task for any artist, the work was divided. Carl Barks mostly worked on the scenes set at sea, while Jack Hanna drew the scenes at the inn and on the island. Barks and Hanna were still new to the comics scene, and weren't sure how much, if any, leeway they had, so they stayed virtually 100% true to the script they were given. Karp had minimalized the dialogue, although it's unclear if there was meant to be much dialogue in the movie at all. In the Disney cartoons from that period, the characters generally didn't have extended conversations. As a result, the comic is an interesting read, since the action is paced in such a way that you really do feel like you're watching a cartoon unfold, more so than a lot of comics. Certain scenes appear to be taken beat by beat from the storyboards. The scene I mentioned where Pete rips Donald's hammock, and then follows a sleepwalking Goofy, this time one of the nephews, and then wanders into the powder room, is a good example. However, although the setup seems to be incredibly faithful, the second act on the island appears to either be condensed or completely rewritten. In this version, Yellow Beak is not captured by Pete, but set adrift with the others. Pete finds that the map they stole has a hole cut in it with vital information missing. Yellow Beak reveals to the ducks that he had the middle section tattooed on his chest, in case of something like this happening. When the heroes find the chest in the cave, it appears to contain Morgan's ghost, who gives them the rest of the map, saying he stole it from Pete. As the heroes depart, the ghost reveals himself to be a disguised Pete, who follows them with his crew and attacks when they dig up the chest. The nephews escape the pirates and knock them out with coconuts. Yellow Beak, Donald, and the nephews sail home triumphantly with the treasure and the captured pirates. The story was published in issue 9 of Dell 4-Color Comics. It has since been reprinted all over the world many times. The reason the story has such a legacy is not only because it's a decent representation of the unmade film. The story was the first true Donald Duck adventure, which helped pave way for many more funny animal adventure stories in the future. Not just ones starring Donald or Mickey, but even non-Disney properties like the Looney Tunes characters. The artists were also notable. Jack Hanna and Carl Barks had already worked on some Donald Duck cartoons as storymen and animators at this point. Hanna would go on to continue writing for the Donald Duck cartoons, and then moved on to directing. He's responsible for some all-time classics like Trick or Treat, Pluto's Christmas Tree, and In the Bag. In the 60s, he moved on to direct Woody Woodpecker shorts for Universal. Carl Barks, meanwhile, stuck to comics after that, and found great success. He went on to create and write for beloved characters like Scrooge McDuck, Gyro Gearloose, and the Beagle Boys. That was not the end of Yellow Beak or even the Morgan's Ghost plot, however. In 1947, a series of small Disney comics were distributed in boxes of Cheerios. While some of these comics have been reprinted in English in recent years, many have not and are very rare. Thankfully, for the sake of this video, one of the relevant ones was reprinted in 2011. Donald Duck and the Pirates was drawn by Jack Hanna, and is a very condensed remake of the original story. Although the first pirate tale seemed a bit stretched out in the 64-page version due to how it was paced, this version of the story is squeezed into 8 pages, which doesn't leave much room for adventuring. In the story, the ducks find Yellow Beak after he's been assaulted by pirates in an alley for his map. As it turns out, Yellow Beak destroyed the map a while back and has committed it completely to memory. Once again, Pete listens nearby. The next day, the ducks head out to buy a ship. They see a sign advertising a rowboat for $8, and a misunderstanding leads them into thinking that a large ship next to the rowboat is the one for sale. The ducks sail off in their accidentally stolen ship, which happens to have Pete and his 2 henchmen sleeping below deck. Pete and the pirates hide out for most of the voyage, and finally snatch Yellow Beak one night at sea. They use an X-ray camera to take a snapshot of the map in the parrot's head, just go with it I guess, and then throw the heroes overboard. As it turns out, they have already reached the island, but the villains didn't realize this, having been hiding the whole time. In the matter of a page and a half, the heroes dig up the treasure and sail off with their prize, leaving the pirates marooned on the island. Obviously, this story is rather sloppy, and the use of borderline sci-fi technology in an otherwise traditional pirate story is strange. However, since this was meant to be nothing more than a serial premium, a lot of the problems can be excused. Although I'm happy it's been reprinted, it's more of a fun curiosity than a great comic. Yellow Beak made a more proper return a few years later in 1949. The Seven Dwarfs and the Pirate was featured in issue 227 of Dell 4-Color Comics and was drawn by Tony Strobel. The story begins with Yellow Beak lost in a storm, looking for crew members for his next voyage. He ends up finding shelter at the Seven Dwarfs' cottage, where the dwarves agree to sail with him, not only for a share of the treasure, but also in hopes of finding a good birthday present for Snow White. Meanwhile, the Wicked Witch seems to have given up on the whole fairest of them all thing, and is now focusing on being the richest. The magic mirror warns her that if Yellow Beak and the dwarves find the treasure, they will all be richer than her. She angrily shatters the mirror in response. Harsh. The treasure hunters set sail the next day, with the witch stowing away disguised as a rat. Dobie sees the witch's transformation, and spends most of the voyage chasing her around the ship, unable to explain to the others that this is no ordinary rat. The witch decides it will be easier to steal the treasure if there are less dwarves to deal with. Yellow Beak runs a tight ship, and is quick to throw disobedient sailors in the brig, so the witch manipulates things so that Sleepy, Bashful, Sneezy, and Happy are locked away. This leaves only Yellow Beak and 3 dwarves: Doc, Grumpy, and Dopey, who are, let's face it, the most memorable dwarves anyway. At this point, things get delightfully silly. A flying fish notices the witch, in her normal form, skulking about the ship, and alerts King Neptune below, who apparently really hates the idea of witches at sea. He orders a few fish to use a switchboard to send out an alert to all nearby storms and hurricanes. The waves come to life, and in a scene that reminds me of the wave monster from An American Tail, begin to throw the ship around and eventually send it flying onto an island. Luckily for the heroes, it happens to be the island on the treasure map. Yellow Beak, the three dwarfs, and the Rat Witch all disembark. Dopey takes off after the rat, while the others dig for the treasure. No sooner do they find the treasure than the witch makes herself known and turns the hunters into cheese, so she can eat them as a rat, get it? Dopey is able to escape with the treasure, but is ultimately on his own against the witch. He finds another treasure hunter and his pet cat elsewhere on the island. Getting an idea, Dopey trades the man the treasure for the use of his cat. The clever dwarf then lures the witch into a small opening, one she needs to transform into a rat to fit inside, leading her right into the cat's jaws. King Neptune shows up and apologizes for the storm the other night, happy to hear that the witch is gone. To make things even, he offers the dwarves an easy ride home on the back of a whale. Everyone arrives home safe, but ultimately empty-handed. Yellow Beak offers to take them on another treasure hunt, but his wife barges in at that moment. It seems the old captain has a flock of children that he's been neglecting this whole time, including a new member, a little orphan chick. Inspired, Doc gives the chick to Snow White as a present, and given her kindly nature toward animals, we can be sure that the parrot will have a good home. Like I said, I really enjoyed this one. The bizarre anachronisms of the fish using technology may have clashed with things a little bit, but not as much as Pete's mind-reading device in the previous comic, since at least this one was just used as a one-panel gag and not a whole plot point. The absurdity of the waves with faces punting the ship around, and the witch turning the good guys into hunks of cheese was great, but there was still a sense of tension in spite of the whimsy. Although the story was more original than the straight remake of Pirate Gold 2 years prior, it still took a lot of beats from the original story. We have Yellow Beak arriving on a stormy night, the villain eavesdropping on the treasure's location, the villain disguising themselves to stow away, and the seemingly helpless character being the one to outwit the bad guy on the island. Despite still being something of a rehash, I think this might be my personal favorite Yellow Beak story. In 1953, the original story would receive yet another remake, this one featuring the characters from Peter Pan. To promote the movie's release, a large comic book called The Peter Pan Treasure Chest was published. The comic itself has become a rarity, selling for hefty prices online. One of the many stories in the comic was called Captain Hook and the Buried Treasure, with a script by Del Connell and art by Dick Morse. While the Seven Dwarfs story took some liberties, this one sticks much closer to its Pirate Gold roots. The Darlings have rented a seaside house for the summer, which comes with a tired old parrot. During a stormy night while their parents are asleep, Tinkerbell comes on a mission from Peter Pan to see the parrot. Of course, the chronically sleepy parrot is really Yellow Beak, and a little pixie dust peps him right up. Captain Hook makes his own dramatic entrance a moment later looking for Tink. He searches around the house, barely acknowledging the Darling children that he once tried to kill. Unable to find Tink, he leaves, but stays outside to listen in. Yellow Beak explains to the kids that he and Peter Pan once saved an old sailor's life, and the sailor told them that a treasure map was hidden in this house. The next morning, Yellow Beak sets off with John and Michael to buy a ship. Again, taking a note from Morgan's ghost, they buy the ship from the disguised villains, although it is Smee who dresses as an old woman this time, as opposed to Hook doing it. At this point, the story is pretty much a straight remake of Pirates Gold, with plenty of scenes and plot points repeated with little deviation. Despite not adding much to the table, I have a soft spot for this version, since it's the first version of the Pirates Gold story I read as a kid. It doesn't do anything wrong, but it generally lacks the energy of the Ducks or Dwarves versions. Also, this might be something of a nitpick, but I really don't like how Michael and Peter's faces are drawn. Something about those eyes. The next story on our list is the only one to feature Mickey and Goofy, and it's also the only story not to feature Yellow Beak. 1961's Clipper Ship Caper is drawn by Paul Murray, who did the art for countless Mickey and Goofy stories around that time. If you've ever picked up an issue of Walt Disney's comics and stories, there's a good chance you've seen one of his works. In general, North American comics around this time were in a pretty sorry state. Censorship laws often stifled creators from writing truly fun or engaging or even interesting comics, and while it's usually superhero, crime, and horror comics that are cited while talking about the shift in quality, kids' comics suffered as well. Although there are some good ones to be found, the US Disney comics from the 60s are mostly lacking in spirit. This comic is no different, unfortunately. In the comic, which originally ran in Mickey Mouse number 77, Mickey is helping an ocean museum that has acquired an old ship located in Alaska. He and Goofy are to pick the ship up and sail it home, but it turns out that Pete and his henchmen have been hiding rare furs aboard in its powder barrels. In order to get on board the ship and dump the furs, Pete disguises himself as an old woman adrift on a raft with a story about how the ship she was on exploded or something. The narration doesn't go into much detail about Pete's phony story, but Mickey, being Mickey of course, is happy to help someone in distress. Pete's identity is almost immediately discovered, leading to the one truly amusing moment in the story where he and Mickey have a sword fight, with Mickey using a swordfish as his weapon. I'm sure I've seen this gag done before somewhere, but it still made me smile a little. As you can see, it's only slightly related to Donald Duck Finds Pirate Gold, but the image of Pete dressed as an old woman striking a match in the powder room couldn't have come from anywhere else. Although all the stories we've covered thus far have been remakes of the original story, it would finally receive a true sequel in 1962. It was printed in Italy under a title that roughly translates to Yellow Beak Returns to the Ocean. When it was printed in English in 2011, its title was simply Donald Duck Finds Pirate Gold Again. Yellow Beak comes to Donald and the nephew's house one stormy night in a moment of deliberate déjà vu. After their initial voyage, he retired, but soon grew unhappy with that life. Now he's back and seeking another treasure. There's more buried treasure on a tropical island out there, and of course, he has the map. By this point, Scrooge McDuck was a huge part of the Ducks comics, so of course he comes along. After all, he knows treasure hunts. Unfortunately for Scrooge, the Beagle Boys were also a big part of Duck comics by this point, so it's only natural that they've been keeping tabs on the miser. They contact a branch of Beagles near where the heroes are headed. I always wondered how many Beagle Boys there actually are in the world. I imagine it's like the massive identical families of Nurse Joyce and Officer Jenny's from Pokemon. True to his nature, Scrooge buys the world's cheapest boat for the voyage. The Beagle Boys attempt to come along disguised as sailors, but Scrooge isn't interested in hiring anyone he has to pay, not when he has his nephews to do it for free. The Beagles are successful later on when they disguise themselves as native pearl divers lost in a storm. Some phony pearls they offer Scrooge seal the deal. The recovery of the treasure is smooth, but the waters on the way home are not. A storm brews, and the cheap ship Scrooge bought barely makes it back to port in one piece. The Beagle Boys throw off their disguises and open the chest to find nothing but worthless metal and a note telling them to get a job. It was an ancient April Fool's joke. The Beagle Boys want nothing to do with the junk and leave. Scrooge gets the last laugh, though, and finds out that the worthless metal is actually platinum, which he makes a fortune off of. In true Scrooge fashion, he writes a gloating thank you letter to the Beagle Boys. Yellow Beak uses his share of the money to buy a fancy new ship where he can do what he loves: sail the seas. Overall, it's a solid duck adventure, and it's very nice to see Scrooge meeting Yellow Beak. I've only read the translated version since I wouldn't understand the Italian version anyway, so I'm not really sure how much of the dialogue was altered. One of the best references that was definitely done by the translators was a panel where Yellow Beak mentions his other former crew members: Young Peter, Sharp Woodward, and the Seagoin' Seven. Now, Young Peter is Peter Pan, the Seagoin' Seven is the dwarves, but who is Sharp Woodward? Well, Yellow Beak's final major appearance was not in a Disney comic at all, but rather an untitled story from Woody Woodpecker number 76. This 1963 story was drawn by John Carey, but otherwise there is little information on it. I mentioned that Jack Hanna, one of the artists who worked on the original Pirate Gold comic, went on to direct Woody Woodpecker cartoons around this time, so I initially assumed this was some sort of inside joke he orchestrated or something. But in an interview with him, while he spoke fondly of the original Donald comic, he also seemed to just see it as another job, albeit a fun one. So I'm not sure if Jack Hanna actually had anything to do with this bootleg Yellow Beak. The comic is sadly very underwhelming once you get past the novelty of the blatant plagiarism. Woody is running a seaside restaurant that is frequented by old sailors who revel in their tall tales. Many of them are from a sailor's retirement center nearby. Woody doesn't believe any of their stories. During a stormy night, he and his nephew and niece, Knothead and Splinter, are visited by a tough pirate who is looking for a parrot named Yellow Beak. As soon as he leaves, the one and only Yellow Beak himself hops out of hiding and asks the other birds help finding buried treasure guarded by a ghost. Woody is skeptical, But when the Parrot shows him a real gold doubloon and an authentic-looking treasure map, he's on board with the hunt. The search leads the birds into a dark cave where the treasure chest lays in plain sight, but so does the ghost guarding it. As Woody and the others run out in fear, a few orderlies from the retirement center have rode up and take back Yellow Beak and the ghost, who was the pirate in disguise. Apparently, these two love to put on a haunted treasure hunt act for anyone willing to go along with their ruse. The only real thing in their routine was the doubloon, which they snatched from museum exhibit. Needless to say, Woody is not amused. This is not a good story, and it fits right in with the dull output of the 60s. However, I'm still amazed it exists. Certain panels, like the pirate listening outside the restaurant, or the ghost rising over the chest, are taken straight from the original story. It's truly shameless. Yes, Disney remade the story a bunch of times themselves, but it was their story. If there was any kind of legal reaction, it hasn't been documented to my knowledge. I'm guessing either Disney didn't know, or just didn't care. The sad thing is that aside from a few cameos, this was the last significant appearance anywhere by old Yellow Beak. With his roots so deep in Disney history, why hasn't Yellow Beak reappeared since the 60s? Perhaps it's because he bears more than a passing resemblance to Donald's friend Jose, who has a pretty sizable fan following, especially in Brazil. On a different note, I sometimes wonder if the parrot that used to perch outside Walt Disney World's Pirates of the Caribbean was meant to be an homage to Yellow Beak. He did have a little chest tattoo and a peg leg. Either way, there may be hope for Yellow Beak yet. In recent years, more Disney Comics characters have been emerging in animation. Minnie's nieces, Millie and Melody, started appearing in the Minnie's Bo-Toon series, despite being in only a small handful of comics over the years. Daisy's nieces, April, May, and June, made a cameo in The House of Mouse and were recently supporting characters in The Legend of the Three Caballero show. Feathery Duck and Neighbor Jones have appeared in the DuckTales reboot. Given the important role that Yellow Beak's story played for Disney Comics as a whole, I wouldn't be surprised if he showed up again at some point. Some treasures are still just waiting to be rediscovered.